Good afternoon, everyone. You've found your way to local proteins, procurement, food safety, crediting, and more. Thanks for joining us this afternoon. Next slide, Jean. So this is part of our Farm to School, Farm to Food Safety webinar series. It's a series of 3. If you missed the one back in March, it's on the farmtoschoolmn.org website. There's a recording there. This webinar is also being recorded, and you can find the recording on the website. And if you aren't registered yet and you're interested, the final webinar in the series is coming up on May 1st, and it's all hosted by the Minnesota Farm to School leadership team and the partners you see listed here. Next slide, Jane. So just some quick introductions. My name is Nora Shields Cutler. I work for the Institute for Agriculture and Trade Policy, and I'm here just as the host. I'll keep an eye on the chat and the questions. If you're having tech issues, I can try to help, probably unsuccessfully, but I feel free to chat or use the Q&A section. Either way should be just fine as you have questions, and we'll pause periodically if there are questions. You should also be able to chat everyone else. So if you want to introduce yourself in the chat, please feel free. And I have 2 experts here with me today. So Jane Jewett is the Associate Director of the Minnesota Institute for Sustainable Agriculture at the University of Minnesota Extension. And she's here to talk about food licensing and regulations. And then I have Jamie Anderson, who's the Farm to School and Early Care Consultant at the Minnesota Department of Education. And she'll share procurement and crediting details with you today. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, and so you can see our agenda here. We'll cover procurement and food safety and inspection standards, meal pattern crediting, and recipe and menu ideas. We will cover a variety of different protein categories. As you can see here, domestic proteins, non-amenable proteins, fancy term. Don't worry, Jane will tell you all about it. Eggs, fish, beans and lentils, tofu and tempeh. And real quick here, just to get started, we're gonna do a quick little poll. In just a second here, you should hopefully see a couple of questions up on your screen. If you would just answer those questions to the best of your ability. We're looking at getting at just the first is about your current local proteins. If you're doing any local purchasing of proteins and what types, and then what you might be interested in doing of things that you aren't currently doing. So if you can check any or all that apply, and then we'll see what we're working with here. We'll give it just another minute or 2 and see if a couple more folks get the chance to answer. Obviously, it's not a quiz. If you get it wrong, it's okay. We won't know. Okay, we're still moving up, so I'm going to give it just 1 more minute. Okay. So let me share the results here just for a minute so you can see we've got some beef, chicken, pork, turkey, and eggs that have all been purchased locally. Also some beans and peas, and then a decent number of folks who haven't done any local protein purchases yet, and a lot of interest in beef, chicken, pork, turkey, big interest in eggs. Going forward. So thanks. It's very nice to know who's in the room. Also, if you have done some local purchasing, we do often hear from local school staff that they'd love to know where where schools are sourcing that from. So if you have a great supplier that you've loved working with and you want to put it in the chat, please feel free. So with that, I'm going to pass it to Jane, who will get us started.
All right, good afternoon, everybody. So I'm Jane Jewett. I work a lot on regulatory questions around local food systems. And today we're going to start out with the animals that provide proteins. So domestic proteins, those are the things you typically think of as farm animals. Beef, cattle, pigs, lamb, goat, chicken, turkey, duck, goose. I noticed on the poll that nobody's been sourcing lamb or goat, which makes some sense because those are more expensive proteins, but also there are populations in Minnesota where those are definitely a preferred protein. And so, you know, as a special event at a school, you might consider them at some point. Then there are also the historically wild game proteins and exotic proteins. So historically wild game include bison, elk, deer, pheasant, rabbit, potentially other things that are native to North America. And then exotics are things that are, you know, native to somewhere else. Camel, caviar, guinea pig, those are a couple of proteins that have come up in recent years as proteins of interest for folks in Minnesota now. So these historically wild game or exotic proteins are considered non-amenable to inspection by the USDA. And this gets complicated because the USDA has a slightly different attitude towards these than the Minnesota Department of Agriculture. So the USDA says that inspection of meats from these animals is voluntary, but in Minnesota, it is not voluntary. So it's not really. In Minnesota, the state legislature and the Minnesota Department of Agriculture have determined that when these things are raised on farms in Minnesota, they are equivalent to the domestic livestock species, and they are going to be required to be inspected in order to be sold. So that's a mismatch between the USDA and the Department of Agriculture, but in Minnesota, states are allowed to be stricter, and the Minnesota attitude towards these prevails. So food safety for meat and poultry products is protected by inspection at the processing plant of all of these things: the live animals as they come in before they're slaughtered, the organs and the carcasses of the animals after slaughter, the facility itself where processing happens, and the written food safety plans that the facility maintains. So that is what inspection status means for a meat processing plant. And in Minnesota, there are USDA inspected plants, and there are Minnesota Equal II USDA plants. The Minnesota Equal II plants do have the same level of inspection as the USDA plants. And the meat processed under inspection at those plants can be sold anywhere that USDA meat can within the borders of Minnesota. The Equal II cannot cross the state lines, but within Minnesota's borders, it can be sold to schools, hospitals, restaurants, grocery stores, individuals, anywhere that USDA inspected meat could be sold. So both of those types of plants have continuous inspection, which means an inspector is present on every day of operations, doing all of those tasks on the previous slide, looking at the animals pre-slaughter, looking at the organs and carcasses post-slaughter, looking at the facility, checking the food safety plans. If you need to find a processing plant We do have lists and maps. The Minnesota Equal To list and the USDA list can both be found at this link. And Nora, if you happen to be in the slide deck and want to pop that into the chat, that would be great. Thank you. Here's a map that's also available on that web page on the MISA website. This includes both USDA and Equal To plants that serve relatively small scale farmers. So there are also a whole bunch of very large USDA plants in the state that are owned by Hormel or Armour or Swift or Genio. Those are not accessible to individual farmers, and so those are not on this map. This map shows the plants where a farmer could reasonably expect to call up the plant and get on the schedule to have an animal processed. The USDA provides quite a bit of information about the type of processing that is offered. And so if you click on one of those bubbles for the USDA plant, it'll pop up a little box with more information. The Minnesota Department of Agriculture does not collect the same level of information on its plants. So unfortunately, if a farmer wants to find out exactly what species are processed and what services are offered, they're going to have to call the plant. It's important to know that there are also plants called custom exempt plants within the state that get their facility inspected a few times a year, but they don't have an inspector present every day. So those plants may refer to themselves as an inspected plant because they are licensed and their facility gets inspected occasionally. But what they do not have is that continuous inspection. They don't have an inspector present every day looking at the animals that come in and get slaughtered. And so meat packages from those plants will not have a mark of inspection on the package, and schools cannot use meat processed at those types of plants. All meat packages for sale to schools and other food businesses must bear a mark of inspection. So the USDA or the Equal To processing plant, when the animal is being slaughtered and processed under continuous inspection, then there will be a mark of inspection on the package. And that mark is proof that an inspector was present to do all those things, verify the health of the animal, the safe operating procedures of the plant, and that the plant was clean and in good repair. And so here's what those inspection marks look like. This is what you have to look for. It kind of doesn't matter where the farmer or the aggregator selling the product says it came from. You need to look for the mark of inspection. So the USDA marks are the circle on the left-hand side. That's going to be the domestic livestock. That circle with the establishment number in it saying inspected and passed. If it's poultry, it's going to have a similar circle, but there'll be a letter P next to the plant number for poultry. And then for those non-amenable species, the farm-raised historically wild game or exotics, there'll be that triangle because the USDA says that's voluntary inspection. So they have like this separate labeling pathway in the plants, even though, again, in Minnesota, it's not voluntary. You have to get those bison or elk or pheasant done under continuous inspection, but they will come out of a USDA plant with that triangle label. So examples of that non-amenable historically wild game or exotics, it's important to note that they do have to be farm raised. Generally wild harvested game is not allowed in schools except for in some tribal settings that we'll talk about a little bit later. But generally for schools, this is going to be farm raised bison or elk or deer or rabbit or what have you. And again, that triangle is going to be on the inspected packages, and that triangle is an acceptable mark of inspection, but that's what you have to look for in order to legally purchase the product. So if any of those animals are processed at a Minnesota Equal 2 plant, remember in Minnesota, all of those species, including the ones the USDA says are non-amenable, in Minnesota, we say those are all meat. If they're farm raised, they're all equivalent to domestic livestock. They're all going to be inspected the same. They're all amenable to inspection. And so no matter what it is, it's going to have that same state of Minnesota outline and plant number as the mark of inspection on the package. So that's what you look for, is that outline of the state of Minnesota. And again, the Equal 2 plants cannot ship across state lines. So there are farmers in Wisconsin, for instance, who are getting animals processed at Wisconsin Equal 2 plants. Their packages are going to have an outline of the state of Wisconsin. If you're a school in Minnesota, you can't buy that. It would have to be a USDA mark if it's coming from Wisconsin. Okay, so farmers who are selling meat to schools or selling meat to aggregators or food hubs that are then selling to schools, do those farmers need a license to sell their product? Well, if no ingredients are added, if it's just the muscle meat, which could be ground or cut up, but no spices, no salt, no cure or anything is added so that it's 100% product of that farmer's farm, then that farmer does not need a license to sell it. That product of the farm provision says farmers are excluded from licensing requirements for their own product of the farm. But if off-farm ingredients are added by the processing plant, for example, the plant makes bratwurst from the farmer's pork by adding salt and spices, then the farmer who's going to take it back and sell it needs a food handler license for that sale, because the spices and the salt are not from their farm. So it's not 100% product to their farm. Any questions about the marks of inspection or the licensing before we talk about safe handling? And Nora's been putting the links in the chat. Thank you. Okay, so safe handling of the products. So if a farmer is having their animals slaughtered and processed at a plant with continuous inspection, they're typically going to get that product back frozen, and they must keep frozen products frozen. So if you're concerned about purchasing directly from a farmer, these are questions you can ask. Do you have a freezer that maintains 0 degrees or below? And then transport. So transporting frozen products, meat or other frozen products, in a temperature controlled vehicle or within a freezer that maintains 0 degrees or below is ideal. However, it is legally fully acceptable for that farmer to transport the frozen product in a cooler, making sure that the product temperature itself doesn't go above 10 degrees Fahrenheit during transport. And that means limiting the time spent out of mechanical refrigeration. But typically, farmers who are doing this type of sale have a freezer that actually holds lower than 0 degrees. Between 10 and 20 degrees below 0 is more typical. And so if they're taking that product out of a freezer, putting it in a cooler, driving it for, half an hour to an hour and a half to get to the school, they're going to be fine. The product temperature is not going to exceed 10 degrees Fahrenheit if it's in a sealed cooler. Farmers need to store and transport the product in clean sanitary conditions, just generally having a space that excludes insects, rodents, birds, etc. And transporting in vehicles that don't have to be dedicated food transport vehicles. It's okay to use a personal vehicle, but it needs to be clear of soil filth, toxic substances, you know, not hauling sick animals in it and then turning around and hauling meat. So we train farmers on this all the time. But again, if as a school of food service, you're concerned about this, these are questions you can ask the farmers and ask them to verify what their transport vehicle looks like and what their cleaning practices are. Tons more information on the local food fact sheet page of the MISA website that includes both the Selling Minnesota fact sheets that are for farmers and fact sheets from the Minnesota Department of Agriculture and Department of Health that are more focused on the buyers, such as schools, and what your legal requirements are to purchase local food. Okay, turning it over to Jamie now to talk about crediting of these things.
Great, thanks so much, Jane. So when you're thinking about crediting local domestic and wild game proteins, the same crediting rules apply as if you were crediting these proteins from your distributor. So 1 ounce of cooked meat equals a 1 ounce equivalent of a meat alternate. The USDA Food Buying Guide has an extensive list of animal protein varieties, cuts, and then processed end products. So there's ground meats, roasts, strips, sirloins, things of that nature. And then you could use that information when determining your crediting values based off of the cut of protein that you are going to be serving. There are many varieties and cuts of wild game. They're also included in the Food Buying Guide. The USDA has really tried to update this so it's more relevant to the populations that we are serving. But if you happen to find a species that you, if you happen to serve a species that you cannot find in the Food Buying Guide, then the general rule of thumb is to credit it similarly, I can't say that word today. Credit it like beef. And then you can obtain verification from MDE, a school nutrition specialist, just to make sure that you did credit it appropriately. There is a link to the Food Buying Guide, and also just thinking about, if you're purchasing any local items from vendors with added ingredients, kind of as Jane said, it is no longer a product of the farm, and you need to make sure that you obtain a child nutrition or CN label or a product formulation statement from that vendor to ensure you're accurately crediting those different components as a meat alternate. If you decide to prepare a homemade product like sausage or meatballs, etc., then make sure that you use the Food Buying Guide and then also the recipe analysis workbook to determine the crediting amounts for that recipe. So we'll talk a little bit more about it at the end, but just make sure that you are crediting it appropriately. Some questions that we sometimes receive about protein items that are actually not creditable are pig's feet, ham hocks, pork bacon, pork belly, and imitation bacon products. So you can still serve these items as a part of your school menu, but they do not credit towards the meat alternate food components. But you also must factor them into the menu nutrient analysis. So, if it's a higher fat content or sodium, you have to make sure that that is included when you're figuring out your menu nutrient analysis. Okay, next slide. So dried meats, dried meat, poultry, and seafood products are now creditable in the meal pattern, but they are not included in the Food Buying Guide for child nutrition programs because industry production standards vary so widely for these products. So in order to serve them as a part of the school meal program, you have to make sure that you have a CN label or product formulation statement. And then just to note, when a product formulation statement is provided for a dried meat product, it should be evaluated to ensure the following crediting principles are followed. So one, you have to make sure the credible meat ingredient listed on the product formulation statement has to match or have a similar description as the ingredient listed on the product label. You need to make sure that the credible meat ingredient listed on the product formulation statement has a similar description to a food item in the food buying guide, and that the creditable amount cannot exceed the finished weight of the product. And we have a link to this information because I know that was very detailed. There's a nice resource that USDA has created just to make sure that you are crediting all of the dried meat components accurately. Thank you, Nora. Next slide, we have some pictures of a couple of different local animal proteins that have been served in our Minnesota schools. So off to the left, we have a smoked beef brisket sandwich that was served at Morris area schools featuring a local beef. Heron Lake, Okabena has a bison burger that they have been serving as part of their school meal program. Minneapolis serves a bison taco on their Minnesota Thursday menus. And then Hutchinson up in the upper right-hand corner did a shredded chicken sandwich in which they sourced whole chickens from a local farmer. So just a couple of different examples of what some of our fellow school districts are serving. And Jane, I'm going to pass it back to you for eggs.
Okay, thanks, Jamie. Yep, eggs next. All right. So shell eggs are a legal product of the farm for farmers to sell. If the farmer has a flock size larger than 3,000, then they have some registration requirements with USDA. But if their flock size is less than 3,000 hens, they're just product of the farm. But farmers who are selling to schools or other food facilities do have to clean, candle, grade, package, and label the eggs that they are selling. And safe cleaning is a challenge for egg producers. You cannot immerse eggs in water because eggshells are porous and they will suck in the water that they are immersed in. And along with that, anything that is in the water, such as E. coli or salmonella bacteria. So no immersion in water. Very small scale egg producers can do dry cleaning of eggs with sandpaper. There are commercial egg washers available for larger scale operations. There's also a protocol for wet cleaning of small batches, small to medium-sized batches, that is listed in the Selling Minnesota Shell Eggs fact sheet. So that involves wetting eggs, but not immersing them. You use a colander or something, other kind of container with holes in it that allows the water to drain away quickly. And there's a whole stepwise protocol in there that you can look at. Candling and grading. So candling is important to detect cracks and UFOs or unidentified floating objects within the eggs. And grading is a way to measure egg freshness. There are tons of resources online for how to do both of those things. There are schematic designs for homemade candlers, which are fine. The main thing is that you just need a light that's kind of concentrated, that can shine through the egg in a darkened room and let you see whether there are cracks or UFOs. Okay, so safe storage and transport of eggs. Farmers who are selling eggs need to store it in mechanical refrigeration that maintains 45 degrees Fahrenheit or below. Again, basic sanitation of an egg storage area, excluding pests and keeping the area free of toxins or soil or filth. Eggs can be transported in closed, clean coolers. Temperature needs to be maintained at 45 degrees throughout transport and delivery. So again, that means limiting the time eggs are out of mechanical refrigeration. The shorter time, the better. But as long as that 45 degrees can be maintained throughout, they can be out of mechanical refrigeration for a bit. Leak-proof ice packs, that's really critical. Using raw ice cubes or raw ice blocks is not acceptable because of the potential for meltwater off of that ice to soak through the cartons and get into the eggs, which again are porous and will soak up water. There is a restriction on using shell eggs in certain situations. So when preschool age children are being fed, there's a requirement to only use pasteurized eggs in situations where like a batter might be mixed up in advance and held before cooking. So shell eggs can be used if it's a bakery item like a cookie or a cake that's going to be mixed up and baked immediately with a thorough kill step. But if it's something like a pancake or an omelet or an egg bake where eggs are commingled and held and then baked or cooked, that requires pasteurized eggs if you are feeding preschool children. Doesn't apply to K through 12. So some schools may have like a head start that they're serving preschoolers in the food service. So just be aware of that restriction. So again, eggs from a farmer's own flock are a product of the farm. The farmer does not need a license to sell those eggs. If it's a food hub or an aggregator, they would need a retail food handler license with a egg handler endorsement on it to sell those eggs. And if the farmer has fewer than 3,000 hens, so they're exempt from the USDA registration, there is still a voluntary registration with the Minnesota Department of Agriculture. That's what the form looks like. Very simple one-page form, no fee associated with that. As far as the Minnesota Department of Ag is concerned, it is voluntary, but they do really, really want farmers to do it. And as a school food service, if you want to require farmers to do this registration before you will buy shell eggs from them, you are thoroughly within your rights to do that. And again, the local food fact sheet series on the MISA website has the Selling Minnesota Shell Eggs fact sheet that is for farmers. If you have farmers who need some information about how to do it. And there is the selling and serving Minnesota shell eggs from the Minnesota Department of Agriculture that will tell you as a food service entity what your legalities are. Okay, Jamie, back to you.
Okay, thanks, Jane. So when crediting local eggs, the crediting is the same as if you were buying eggs from your distributor. So only whole eggs, so they must have the egg yolk and white, are able to be credited to the meat alternate meal pattern. And one large egg equals a 2-ounce equivalent for meat alternate. So factors to consider with local eggs is to make sure that the egg is designated as a large egg. So you can meet the full crediting requirements. If it is a smaller egg, then it could only potentially credit for 1 ounce equivalent meat alternate, or none at all, just depending on the size. So just make sure that it is designated as a large size egg. Parts of eggs, again, they're not creditable. So you cannot credit just the egg yolk. You cannot credit just the egg white or any liquid egg substitutes. Next slide. Here we have a couple of pictures of some happy kiddos and parents eating a breakfast, a farm to school breakfast at Glacial Hills Elementary. So every month they have a Breakfast with Buddies program in which it's open to all students and families, and they can come in and have a breakfast together. And they often are featuring a local egg dish. So we have a picture of scrambled eggs, and then they also did an egg bake. And on to fish and seafood.
All righty. So, the domestic livestock and historically wild game were under USDA jurisdiction, sorry, with fish and other seafood. Those are under FDA jurisdiction, Food and Drug Administration, except for catfish. So fish generally, except for catfish, are not processed at meat or poultry processing plants. They don't have that continuous inspection. There's not an inspector who is looking at every fish or every shrimp as it is processed. But the facilities are inspected and they are licensed by the Minnesota Department of Agriculture, which has authority from FDA to run that licensing in Minnesota. So fish processing facilities are licensed as wholesale food processor or manufacturer facilities, unless that fish is product to the farm. There are some farms that are raising fish in fish ponds or containers on the farm. And if those farmers are doing their own processing of their own fish that they raised, then that would qualify as product to the farm. But regardless of whether the seller of the fish is required to be licensed or not, they are required to comply with the federal seafood HACCP, hazard analysis and critical control points requirements, if they are selling to schools or any other food business. So those are detailed in chapter 21 of the Code of Federal Regulations, section 123. There's the link to it. Typically, you're going to see fish that have been processed under a license, but if you do have a farmer raising and processing their own fish, then you need to make sure that they are complying with that seafood HACCP. So, yeah, regardless of whether the farmer is processing it themselves or doing it under a license or someone else is processing it for them under a license, if it's being sold wholesale to a school, it must comply with that federal seafood HACCP, which the technical name of it is the Fish and Fisheries HACCP. Then we get into some situations with tribal members and tribal schools and schools that serve primarily tribal members, Native American students. So tribes do have food sovereignty and hunting, fishing, and gathering rights. So non-tribal harvesting of wild fish for sale is something that can happen under a commercial fishery license from the Department of Natural Resources. So there are people who have a commercial fishing license. Fishing in Lake Superior with a commercial fishing license is one of the examples. That wild harvested commercially caught fish is not product to the farm, and the processing of it must be done under a wholesale food manufacturing license from Minnesota Department of Ag, and again, in compliance with that federal seafood HACCP, which the licensing process will ensure that that HACCP plan is in place. Okay. Back to you, Jamie.
Great. So crediting for fish and seafood, again, very similar to our other animal proteins. 1 ounce of cooked lean fish or seafood meat is equal to 1 ounce equivalent of a meat alternate. You can refer to the food buying guide again for any specific varieties of fish or formats of fish, whether it's canned, fresh, a fillet. Items that are not creditable in the fish and seafood category are ceviche, which is a raw fish or seafood that is marinated in usually some form of a citrus acid. Any home pickled fish, and then sushi. So any raw seafood or sashimi would not be creditable in the National School Lunch Program. We have two examples from Mesabi East. So I have a picture of some food service staff, I believe, and then a picture of their walleye preparation. So they had two different recipes in which they featured locally sourced walleye. We have a baked walleye with a citrus butter, and they did walleye tacos. Short break, Jane, back to you.
Okay, here's where I'm going to dive a little deeper into situations with tribal members selling protein products or schools who are serving primarily Native American students, because there are a lot of nuances with this situation. So again, with tribal members, the wild harvesting and sale of products does not require a license because they retain rights to hunt, fish, and gather in ceded territory. And ceded territory is land given up in treaty agreements, and is not restricted to the tribal trust land or reservation land. So particularly in northern Minnesota, for instance, there are tribal government authorities that issue permits for Native American members of the tribe to do wild harvesting and sale of products. They may require the tribal member to have an identification card that's similar to a hunting or fishing license in order to exercise those hunting, fishing, and gathering rights. And some tribes do restrict the sales of certain products. Some that are culturally important that they don't want sold so much, but things like wild rice or wild harvested fish, those can be sold. So tribal members who harvest wild fish according to the regulations of their tribal government can sell it commercially, including to schools, including to non-tribal schools. However, if they are selling to a non-tribal school, the FDA facilities registration and federal HACCP requirements do apply, that seafood HACCP. If they're selling to a tribal school, then the tribal government takes precedence and decides what they require. So also there is this provision in the USDA Food and Nutrition Service requirements that schools that serve more than 50% Native American children, whether those are reservation schools or whether they are off-reservation public schools that serve more than 50% Native American children, they can receive wild harvested wild game or fish and serve it to the student population. So the school food service then is responsible for ensuring that the carcass is properly handled. Any non-tribal harvesting of wild game must be done legally under a DNR license, Department of Natural Resources license. But wild game harvested by a non-tribal individual could also be donated to a school that serves more than 50% Native American students. The wild harvesting does not have to be done by a tribal member, but that wild harvested game can only be used by a school that serves more than 50% Native American students. And again, the school food service is responsible for proper handling of the carcass. If it is a tribal school, again, tribal law would take precedence. If it's a non-tribal school, the Department of Ag would really like to have a conversation with that school food service about whether their facilities are adequate for proper handling of the carcass. And if anybody's in that situation, we can connect you with the correct Department of Ag person. So there is a website about serving traditional Indigenous foods in child nutrition programs. And the serving of traditional Indigenous food does not at all have to be limited to schools that serve primarily Native American students. It can be a cultural education thing that happens in any school. Back to you, Jamie.
Okay. So yes, as Jane mentioned, that is a really, really amazing resource that the USDA has created that really lays out the different strategies and procurement options for serving traditional Indigenous foods in your school meal program. The USDA also updated the food buying guide recently to include a variety of traditional Indigenous foods. If you would like to serve a traditional Indigenous food that is not listed in the food buying guide, you can refer again to the resource that Jane had mentioned on the previous slide to see if there is any specific guidance on the food item that you're looking to serve. If the item and quantity is not specifically listed in the buying guide, you can determine crediting using two possible methods. So using yield information for a similar food. So it could be beef, could be chicken, poultry, bison, something that is listed. Or you could conduct an in-house yield study. In these occurrences, traditional Indigenous foods, most likely will credit towards similar foods that are found in the food buying guide. And you can always ensure that you're doing your crediting appropriately by checking with a consultant or a specialist from the Minnesota Department of Education, and then also in conjunction with the Minnesota Department of Agriculture, if it is a little bit more of a complicated situation. Next slide. So we're moving away from the animal proteins into the plant-based proteins.
Yep. Tofu, tempeh, and miso, soybean-based products. These products are all potentially hazardous due to the high water activity and high pH. Water activity and pH level, if it's low water activity, so a dry product, and low pH, so an acidic product, those are factors that are protective against rapid growth of bacteria. But these products don't have those protective factors, so they are potentially hazardous. And they are fermented products, which means that there is a HACCP plan requirement to make them in a school food service. So if you are intending to make these products in-house, then you must speak to your inspector from the Department of Health or your local delegated authority health inspector and get advance approval to make these products and get a specific HACCP plan approved by your inspector before you can make them. If they're made by a farmer for sale or a food maker, these would almost certainly have to be made under a license, even if the farmer is growing the soybeans to make them, because they do require some additional ingredients. And also, I believe on Jamie's upcoming slides, it says that the USDA requires these to be commercially prepared for use in a school food service. So really, you're looking at licensing for these products to be made. If they are made under a retail license, there would be that HACCP plan requirement. If they're made under a wholesale food processing and manufacturing license, there wouldn't be that HACCP plan requirement, but the maker would be required to follow the preventive controls for human food requirements in that Code of Federal Regulations chapter. And also would have to register with the Food and Drug Administration as a food facility. So that wholesale food processor and manufacturer license is $169 a year at the low end. That's for a threshold of up to $125,000 worth of annual sales. And license costs go up after that. Back to you, Jamie.
Okay, so as Jane had mentioned, tofu and tempeh, they are both soybean derived foods. Tofu has the basic ingredients, the whole soybeans, a coagulant, typically salt or acid, and then water. They do need to be commercially prepared only, and they must be easily recognizable. So for example, any tofu that might be like a silken form or a smooth form that might be added into items to improve the nutritional makeup, to add different texture to the food item. Like let's say you're putting it in a smoothie or sauces or a baked dessert. It is not easily recognizable, therefore it would not count towards the meat alternate meal pattern requirement. So it must be easily recognizable. Think of kind of like a center of the plate, kind of an entree use for this product. The crediting is listed there. So a 2.2 ounces or a quarter cup volume that has at least 5 grams of protein would be a 1 ounce equivalent for meat alternate. And then also tofu is often sold in 1 pound blocks. So a 1 pound block would give you a 7.25 ounce equivalent of a meat alternate. Tempeh is a fermented soybean cake that's made with whole soybeans. So you can see a picture of it, much more recognizable with the soybeans versus tofu, which is usually processed in a little bit smoother consistency. Again, commercially prepared only. It must be easily recognizable. And then it's a 1 ounce of tempeh equals 1 ounce of meat alternate for the meal pattern requirement. A little bit more description that it must be made from soybeans, water. There's a tempeh culture, which is allowed. You could add some different seasonings, herbs or vinegar to the tempeh product. But if you're adding any other additional ingredients like grains, seeds, or vegetables that would actually contribute and change the nutritional composition of the product, then you must obtain a CN label or product formulation statement from your manufacturer. All right, next slide. We have a teriyaki tofu menu item that was served at Roseville Public Schools. So they have their tofu marinated, obviously, in a teriyaki sauce with some brown rice and some snow peas. A couple different options that I found. Chicago Public Schools did a tofu scramble breakfast taco. And then the lunchbox, which is put on by the Chef Ann Foundation, had a recipe that looked really great for a Thai tofu curry. And moving on to beans, peas, and lentils.
Okay, we're getting to the easy part now. This is way less complicated in terms of regulations. So in their dry state, these are raw agricultural commodities. And if they're sold dry by the farmer who grew them, they are product of the farm. The farmer does not need a license to sell them to any buyer, including a school. If they're sold dry by an entity other than the farmer, such as a food hub, that entity needs a food handler license from the Minnesota Department of Agriculture. But that's about it. Otherwise, they're considered a non-potentially hazardous food in the dry state. So easy peasy, you can buy them.
And a fun fact about beans, peas, and lentils is we actually found a bean quiz. So Nora's going to throw it in the chat and you can take the quiz and figure out your bean personality. So beans, easy peasy and super fun all at the same time. The legume group has kind of been rebranded and renamed as the beans, peas, and lentils subgroup. They are the beans, peas, and lentils are the dried edible seeds of a legume. And a legume is just a scientific term that describes a plant with a pod. Beans, peas, and lentils crediting quantity is actually changed recently to more accurately reflect the caloric consumption of meat-based proteins. So crediting for all categories for beans, peas, and lentils is a quarter cup of cooked product equals 1 ounce equivalent for meat alternate. We've listed a couple different bean varieties, dried peas, and then lentils, which also could be referred to as pulses. This group, it could count towards a meat alternate, or it could also count towards a vegetable subgroup. You can only use it towards one meal component, either vegetables or meat alternate. However, you could offer, if you offered 2 distinct different servings of the beans, peas, and lentils food category in one meal, then they could count towards 2 different meal components. So for example, if you had chickpeas that were offered as a part of a composed salad, let's say, and you wanted to include that and or have that as a part of your vegetable component, you could count your chickpeas as a part of your vegetable meal pattern component. And then you're also serving in that same meal kidney beans, which are a component of like a chili or bean-based soup. Then you could use those kidney beans as a meat alternate component. So again, just 2 different distinct uses of those beans, peas, and lentils food products. Beans cannot credit towards the meal pattern if they are blended and added to items such as desserts. So very similar with our tofu. They have to be easily recognizable to count towards a meal, or excuse me, to count towards a meat alternate meal pattern. They can be added though to enhance the nutritional profile of dessert-based items. But it's also important to note that, you know, while you might be improving the nutritional content of the food that the child is eating by having it in a dessert or, you know, some other food item, it's also not encouraged to distinguish and try to disguise our vegetables. We want to make sure that kiddos know that they are really beneficial to eat. And, you know, we want to encourage them to eat a variety of healthy fruits and vegetables. So feel free to add, but then also maybe mark it and let them know that, you know, they're having a bean-based brownie or whatever it might be. Okay, next slide. Couple quick little recipes. So Hutchinson has a farm to school cowboy beans recipe that they feature on their menu regularly. And then in the Minnesota Harvest of the Month on that website, we have a Moroccan crispy roasted chickpeas recipe. And I know that there are a lot of schools that will do roasted chickpeas and things like that. So yeah, those are something that would be available locally. And kind of just wrapping things up here. I just wanted to, you know, we talked a lot about different crediting guidelines. You know, a lot are very similar, but I wanted just to have kind of a wrap-up slide that just shows what the 1 ounce equivalent for meat alternates are. So you can see, you know, we have our domestic proteins, our wild exotic game, there's the 1 ounce cooked protein, eggs. So a half a whole egg is a 1 ounce equivalent, whereas a 1 full whole egg would be a 2 ounce meat alternate equivalent. Fish is 1 ounce cooked, beans, peas, and lentils we just talked about as a 1/4 cup, and then tofu and tempeh, depending on 1 ounce for tofu and 2.2 ounces or 1/4 cup by volume for tofu. So there's a really helpful resource that USDA has put together, kind of a tip sheet. Nora just included it in the chat. I think it does a really nice job of laying all this out for you and having some different examples. And there's even a little test your knowledge section too, to see if you have really grasped the different concepts of crediting. So just a reminder too, items that do not specifically credit towards the meal pattern, you're still welcome to serve it as a part of your menu. And you just need to make sure that you're factoring it into your nutrient composition of the menu. So, you know, counting the calories, sodium, sugar, or whatever the case may be. Next slide. All right, so when in doubt, calculate it out. So again, I mentioned this several times throughout the presentation, but the USDA Food Buying Guide is kind of the ultimate resource and go-to place to determine, you know, what the protein item that you're serving, how that can contribute to the meal pattern. They have a lot of different training modules and videos and how-to workbooks that you can review just to make sure that you're doing it correctly. There's a guide, like a calculator, there's an interactive tool. There's also information about grains, and then we have the recipe analysis workbook, which you can use if you're trying to do identify what the meal pattern contributions would be if you're doing something from scratch. And I think that's it. Are there any questions? A lot of information that we shared today. Definitely understand just kind of the processing and revisiting this information. We will be sending out a link and to the recording and then to the slide deck I believe we'll be sending it out to participants that registered, right, Nora? And then we'll also have it on the Minnesota Farm to School website. So it'll be a great way just to kind of revisit if you're unsure, or, you know, making sure that you have all the appropriate links for the various resources that Jane and I shared today.
So I think I just want to thank everybody for joining us today, and for Jane and Jamie for sharing a lot of great information. You can see their contact information and kind of the basic reasons you might reach out to Jane or Jamie if you have questions. And if you joined us today, thank you so much. And if you're viewing this later, hope you found this helpful. So thank you all.